Hello, everyone. Hi. So, welcome back to the YAP Eat Repeat podcast. My name is Adele. I am your favorite social media girly who loves makeup. And this episode is really special. One, because we are filming this during Filipino American History Month. And two, because I'm absolutely excited to talk about today's topic, which is Nurse Unseen, which is a documentary which was released earlier this month about Filipino nurses. Before we dive in, how is everybody doing? Right now, I am filming this on a Saturday. I am using a mic today, and I think I'll be using a mic moving forward, honestly, because my neighborhood gets really, really loud, especially on the weekends. So that's why I kind of had to isolate my audio a little bit more. We will be talking about a documentary that is super special to me because honestly, it relates to one of the reasons why I started podcasting in the first place. So today, I will be talking about the documentary directed by Emmy Award winning director Michele Josue and produced by Carlo Velayo, which is Nurse Unseen. So today I will be talking about the documentary, sort of the overall themes that I recognize, as well as my thoughts and comments. So definitely tune in because I think even though this is somewhat of a niche story about Filipino history, if y'all tune into the Yap Eat Repeat podcast, you better care about Filipino history because I'm Filipino. And two, I think the themes about this particular story are just so universal and so relatable. Even if you don't come from a family of Filipino nurses, there is something that I think will resonate with everybody, which is why I feel like this documentary was so powerful. Now, for those of you who may be unfamiliar, I started podcasting. I think my first podcast episode was during my junior year of college, where I did a project for an independent news program called the Laura Flanders Show. I always love to talk about that story because it's a really interesting one. But basically, I grew up in a family of pretty much mostly Filipino nurses, right? My aunts, my uncles, my cousins, my parents are Filipino nurses. So it's a story that's really important to me. And it's honestly something that's very, very close to home for me. So I think that my story and why I do podcasting today is so funny because in reality, when you look at it, my desire to get into the career that I am in right now is because of nursing, but not in the way that you think it is. So, initially, my pitch was to investigate the discrimination that Asian American women experience. So, of course, I had backups because I like to stay prepared. And one of my backups was to look into the alarming death rates of Filipino nurses during the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, I've studied this extensively, but sometimes I do forget some of the stats. But if I remember correctly, Filipino nurses make about 3 to 4% of American or nurses here in the United States. But during the COVID-19 pandemic, especially at the height of it, 30% of them were dying at pretty much alarming rates. Now, at the time, I was like not even interested in pursuing that kind of story simply because I come from a family of nurses. Now, growing up, coming from an immigrant family, I was always the kid who just honestly who was very like rebellious, always kind of did her own thing, like really wanted to go down a different path. And having Filipino nurses for parents was really, really difficult simply because, you know, as a young adult now, I understand where they were coming from. But as a kid, like I always kind of resented the fact that my parents always pushed that career onto me because knowing myself and the kind of person that I am, that's just not the career that I am personally built for. So when I was looking into that story lead, I was like, girl, this is just a backup. Like, I'm not even going to think about it because I love this particular pitch. But what was funny is during that pitch meeting, my supervisor, Dominic, who honestly, I thank you so much for pushing me in the right direction. But Dominic was like, Adele, maybe just keep an open mind. I know you're really set on this one idea, but maybe after doing a little bit more research, you actually might like other pitches. And at the time, listen, I will be very humble and say that I am someone who's very set in their ways and can be very stubborn and hard headed. And at the time, I was like, girl, like, you don't even know what you're talking about. But in reality, after looking at, the research and looking into my pitches a little bit more, I realized that, the story about Filipino nurses was something that was definitely worth looking into. At the time, I was working for the Laura Flanders Show, which is essentially an independent news program. And if you aren't tuned into the Laura Flanders Show, I highly suggest that you do, simply because I love the work that they do. They highlight so many amazing stories, especially as they relate to marginalized groups. So I highly recommend that you tune in. And one of the things that was really hammered into my head at the time is the difference between independent and mainstream news outlets. Now, I wouldn't say that it's a very black and white distinction, because I think there are pros and cons to each. But essentially, if y'all aren't aware, mainstream news outlets today are owned by at least one of six corporations. You're getting a really filtered sense of reality simply because these news outlets are funded and backed by these corporations who are really driven by money and driving profit. And because of that, they sometimes might sensationalize these stories, especially as they relate to marginalized groups. And they might focus more so on the problem, but not actually providing solutions. That was something that really sticks with me to this day, of how sometimes certain news outlets tend to sensationalize certain things and not actually provide solutions, because people turn to the news to stay informed and they want solutions, they want answers. And if all of the media that you're tuning into only sensationalizes things and doesn't actually provide solutions, that really makes people feel more anxious and hopeless and cynical. And honestly, what I loved about the Laura Flanders Show and other independent news outlets is a lot of them are, and I'm not saying that this applies to all independent news outlets. These were just the ones that I was familiar with at the time, but many of them aren't driven by the same motivations that some mainstream news outlets are. And so because of that, they have more freedom to talk about whatever it is that they want to talk about. And because of that, there is more of this incentive to, I guess, speak the truth, to say what you really want to say, and also to provide solutions too. I think it's really important to, I know this is going to sound cheesy, but like, understand the importance of words and the importance of the news outlets that you tune into, because all of those things really affect your perception of reality. And if you're getting this very filtered perception of reality, then it's not going to be very real, is it? And simultaneously, I think that was why I was frustrated with the way that people were portraying these stories about Filipino nurses, because people just seemed so focused on the fact that they were dying. But from my research, nobody asked, okay, what are we going to do about it? And that is why I went into that story, because I wanted to add more of a positive, helpful note to this particular narrative. And so when I heard that they were producing a documentary about Filipino nurses during the COVID-19 pandemic, I was like, girl, you don't even need to tell me about what this documentary is going to be about, because I simply want to watch it. This is a topic that I'm super passionate about and love to talk about, because it's just super close to my heart. So let's get into my thoughts, comments, and things that I noticed during the documentary. So, one thing about me, when it comes to things that I want to review or give my commentary on, I always try to watch it at least twice. And I did, guys, I watched it twice within the span of maybe like 3 to 4 days, because honestly, like, I love this stuff and I love researching this kind of stuff. And something that I studied has become a documentary was honestly super interesting. And it was just absolutely no question that I had to watch it. I think one of my overall thoughts after watching the documentary twice is I really wish that it was a multi-episode series that was released on maybe like a streaming platform or even independently. Girl, like, because I love this story so much, like, I would literally pay to watch this again. I wish it were a multi-episode series, simply because there were so many factors that contributed to that particular point in history where Filipino nurses were dying at alarming rates. I mean, we had American colonization, the Marcos regime, the Trump administration, the rise in Asian violence, the opening and closing of American borders. I mean, there were so many things, and I think the documentary overall was amazingly well paced. I mean, it had the levity, it had the gravity, and it had all of these amazing things that made you laugh and cry at the same time. I mean, I cried twice. I literally cried like both times that I watched it. I cried both times that I watched it, guys. Even in the short amount of time, it was so well paced. And I absolutely love the progression of the story. But I feel like it definitely would have been amazing as a multi-episode series, because I sat in on a couple of Q&A sessions, and the producer Carlo Velayo was like, this could have very easily been like a 6-hour documentary, which honestly I would have sat in and watched as well. Another thing that came to mind is how emotional I got during both showings that I went to. So like I mentioned earlier, I come from a family of Filipino nurses, and my parents are both Filipino nurses themselves. They've been working in the nursing they've been working as nurses since the 90s, so they're really like established in their field. And I'm from New York too. I'm from New York, and during the COVID-19 pandemic, New New York New York was really a hotbed for, COVID-19 patients. In the documentary, it was said that New York is basically a portal to the rest of the world. The people who are already probably sick with COVID-19 probably passed through New York as well. And that certainly hit a lot of New York hospitals, especially the ones that my parents worked into. I remember them saying that they had to work super hard to convert certain parts of the hospital into, emergency areas. It was just absolutely mayhem. And I don't think I processed it at the time, again, because I think when you're, I guess, mentally in survival mode, or you're just trying to process all of like the crazy shit that's happening during the pandemic, you don't really get to sit back and really realize, like, oh, break, like, oh, like, I've experienced something absolutely crazy in just, at the time I was like 20, in the 20 years of life that I've lived. Like, this is something that I couldn't have even expected. And I think the documentary really brought me back. I'm like trying not to get emotional. Ew. I don't know why I'm crying. I did not expect this. What the heck? I especially cried like both times. It was always at like the same time in the documentary where it dawning upon me that my parents could very well not come back, especially because New York was such a hotbed for COVID. And because my parents are a little bit older, right? My parents are in their mid to late 50s. My mom, especially, she previously had breast cancer. Already they were immunocompromised. And it was at the same point in the documentary when this was the first Filipino nurse who died in the US because of COVID-19. Her name was Rosary Castro Olega. And every single time, like, her death in particular just like gets me every single time.
Okay, editor Adele here. I don't know where the footage went for that clip. At the beginning of the pandemic, nurses were informed to not wear masks in front of patients because it made them feel uncomfortable. Absolutely crazy. And because of that, unfortunately, Rosary got sick with COVID. And because it was so early in the pandemic, her family couldn't even be there with her physically. Like, they had to watch from the window. And, her daughter organized all of these voicemails to be played for Rosary before she passed away. And it was really just like, of course it's sad, right? Like, not being able to be with your mom physically before she passes, but also too, like, as a Filipino myself, like, you just can't help but cry and take it personally. One, because I feel like Filipinos see themselves and others, and two, like, so many of us relate to the story of, having a Filipino nurse as a parent and seeing them basically risking their lives to go to work and help these people.
Another thing that I absolutely loved about it is the balance that it has between really highlighting the gravity of the situation and the deaths of Filipino nurses, but also highlighting a lot of other positive aspects as well. I think sometimes when it comes to documentaries and films, TV shows, or whatever the case may be about BIPOC, they always focus on the tragedy of it all. And sometimes they don't balance it out with other things that make us so amazing, like, our sense of bayanihan, our resilience, which is a double edged sword. Our resilience, our ability to rise above things even in the face of adversity, our ability to laugh at certain things, and just the joy that Filipinos bring to the world, I think, is something that the film did so beautifully. Something that the documentary did so beautifully. I forget what her name is. I think her last name was Pambua. I could be very, very wrong. But anyways, her her mother, was also a nurse, right? Her mother was also a nurse, and in the time that she was working during the pandemic, she unfortunately got sick with COVID. And the way that they were portraying it in the documentary is like her ending is kind of unknown. They kind of left us on the bit of like on the edge of our seat a little bit with her particular story. And what I loved about the timing of the documentary is again just the balance of the gravity and the levity of just this entire situation and being able to sit with the emotions but also be able to laugh and have fun during this documentary. It was we were kind of left on the edge of our seats, and luckily it was revealed that she survived. But just looking at her story of triumph, I think was something that I really enjoyed too, simply because she viewed COVID as somebody she was going to fight. Like it wasn't somebody who was going to take her down, and she's like, COVID, you are not going to get one over me, blah blah blah. And what's so funny is she cursed and she's like, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to curse, which is so funny because I think it's like, girl, it's okay to curse. Like, you've just been through something that was so traumatic, and the fact that you fought back and you won is crazy. And I think that was a part of the documentary that I really enjoyed, again, because it felt like you were right there with her from beginning to end of her story. It was such a beautiful way to follow up Rosary's story because I think in the midst of remembering our lost ones, it's also important to recognize the triumph stories of our other Filipino nurses who got sick with COVID-19 and fortunately got better. And I think the documentary did a really good job of making us feel connected to the people in the documentary. I think already Filipinos very much feel like connected with each other regardless of where we are in the world. I think our Filipino radar is always going off. Like, no, I love recognizing other Filipino people. It's like, okay, and my baddies will know this. My definition of shooting my shot is looking at somebody until they're brave enough to come over to me. Like, I think I'm outgoing to a certain extent, but if I find somebody attractive, if I find you attractive, you would know because I start looking at you. I'm like, let's play a little game just between you and I. Like, I'm literally gonna start staring at you. But as it relates to my Filipino radar, that's basically how I clock when somebody is Filipino. Like, if I see, um, if I see a pearl necklace, no, I'm kidding, ukulele, I'm like, "Uy, Filipino ka ba?" Like, literally, like, my Filipino radar goes off like crazy. It goes off like crazy. Um, and I feel partly because I feel so connected with other Filipinos. That's why I felt so deeply connected to the story. But I think ultimately, regardless of that, the documentary does an amazing job at tugging on your heartstrings and really making you feel like you're right there with the people in that documentary because of how personable and how intimate the story feels. And speaking of how connected Filipinos are, guys, okay, so again, like I mentioned earlier, I come from a family of Filipino nurses. So my parents have been working as nurses here in New York for about 30 plus years, right? So they've made their connections with the Filipino nursing community. And I'm not here to say that all Filipinos are related, but we all have some link to each other in some way or another, right? So there was this Filipino nurse that they interviewed. Her name was Aveline. Why am I pronouncing it with a Filipino accent? Her there are some things that I actually just pronounce with a Filipino accent that I don't realize is actually an English word. But anyways, her name is Aveline, right? She was a nurse that they interviewed in the documentary, and my parents had already watched the documentary because they had gone to like a conference before and then heard about the documentary and watched it. Anyways, they had watched it, and I FaceTimed my mom after I watched it for the first time, and she's like, Del, do you know that we know Tita Aveline? I'm like, Mom, like, please, Please do not tell me that you know Tita Aveline, because that is crazy. Like, we are not beating that the Filipinos are all related to each other allegations. Like, we are not beating the allegations, babes. Because the fact that she knows Tita Aveline is so crazy. Like, girl, I'm literally related to a movie star? Question mark, question mark. But it's so crazy because there were, like, I think two people that I recognized in that story in the documentary. One, aside from Tita Aveline, I did my own podcast as well. I actually interviewed one of the people that they interviewed, who is Dr. Leo Felix Jurado, who is a professor of nursing, if I'm not mistaken, in New Jersey, and he was also previously in leadership for the Philippine Philippine Nurses Association. Okay, um, so seeing that he was in the documentary as well was so crazy because, girl, I interviewed him just 2 years ago, and the fact that he's in this same story is honestly just so interesting, and it was super like, whoa, like, oh my god. But shout out to Dr. Jurado, because he literally came onto my podcast project and he literally came onto my podcast project for the free, like, for the free. Thank you, mama, thank you. Thank you, Tito, because babes, there was no budget whatsoever. I was just a junior in college with a dream and a busted ass Mac. Okay, busted ass Mac that honestly, like, woo. But literally, it was just me, Final Cut Pro, Canva, and a dream. Okay, no budget whatsoever. So shout out to Dr. Jurado for coming on to my podcast for the free. So now let's get into other things that I noticed in the documentary. So I'm going to start off with the three themes that I identified. Of course, there are other themes as well. There were so many things that they touched upon, and it was all still very cohesive. That's another thing that I have to give to the story as well, is because there were so many jumps between the past and the present, and I love that it all felt very cohesive. My parents watched this documentary, and one thing about me when it comes to my parents is I love clocking my dad's tea. Okay, I love clocking my dad's tea, and it's nothing against him. It's just sometimes, like, men have to be humbled, okay? Like, I literally come from a family of mostly women, okay? Like, the people who really run the shit in the household is the women, in my opinion, especially from my experience. So I just love humbling men. But one of his critiques was like, there were just way too many angles that they examined this documentary from. And as someone who understands the history and the flow of this story, I was like, hold up, wait. For me personally, that is not a valid critique, because if you really look at every single aspect as a whole, it all makes sense, because you really have to look at those different points in history in order to understand how we got here in the first place. These are the three themes that I made note of in the documentary. The first being, and I think it's an overarching theme, is that the personal is political and vice versa. Now, when I was sitting in on these Q&A sessions, both of them were saying that, when they were pitching this story, they were struggling to convince people because, people were tired of the COVID story. It's about Filipino nurses, which is a niche community. But I absolutely appreciate the timing of this documentary because, again, the election is coming up very, very soon. It's just around the corner. I'm actually going to be doing some early voting because, girl, I got to make sure that my vote is in, especially this year. I absolutely love this theme, especially because I was a sociology major back in my undergrad. And one of the first things that we go over in our sociology 101 classes is the sociological imagination. And I actually will be doing like a whole sociology 101 episode, so just stay tuned for that one. Because I think in order to really listen to my podcast and understand where I'm coming from and why I always tie it back to the patriarchy is because of the sociological imagination. So the sociological imagination was coined by C. Wright Mills, who basically poses that things simply don't happen in a vacuum. When somebody experiences something, there is a high likelihood that it is tied to a larger socio-political economic history. I'd say three major points of the documentary is the political backdrops that they covered throughout the film, which were American colonialism, the Marcos regime, as well as the COVID-19 pandemic, all of which play an important role into leading us to where we were back in 2020, where Filipino nurses were dying at alarming rates. Like, there are a lot of Filipino nurses in the US, like, you can't walk into a hospital without seeing a Filipino nurse. And that really sparked my interest when I first did my podcast. It's like, why are there so many Filipino nurses? And the answer is partly American colonialism. So in the 20th century, the US colonized the Philippines, and they colonized the Philippines under the guise of benevolent assimilation. In the process, they essentially built all of these like American hospitals within the Philippines, and they started training these Filipino nurses under US nursing standards, which inadvertently prepared them to become nurses over here in the US. I would say that was really the beginning of the pipeline for many Filipino nurses to begin their careers over in the US. Another thing that came up in my research is the lack of pay that Filipino nurses really get in the Philippines. Now, I'm not entirely sure of what the pay rate is for nurses in the Philippines currently, but I know, especially during the Marcos regime, like, girl, they were just to be a nurse in the Philippines was basically to be paid the same amount as a janitor. Like, it was just not a livable wage. And aside from the lack of a livable wage, the Marcos regime also played a major role as to why so many Filipinos, especially Filipino nurses, immigrated to the US to live a better life, because truly it was a turbulent time. And that marks the second point in history that the documentary touches upon. He ruled the Philippines from the 1960s to the 1980s. They call this man a whole kleptocrat. And if y'all know anything about kleptomaniacs, they love to steal. And that was pretty much the whole vibe, if you will, for the Marcos family and the way that they ruled over the Philippines. I watched a documentary a few years ago about Imelda Marcos and her time as like the first lady of the Philippines. And, you know, the Marcos family was really credited for putting the Philippines on the map, essentially. And I would compare their reign and their presidency to that of King Louis and Marie Antoinette. It's like this facade of opulence and wealth. In reality, so many people were struggling. One thing that I really remember from the Imelda Marcos documentary, I think it's called like Steel Butterfly or something like that. You know, she was a very grandiose woman, okay? She had an extensive collection of designer clothes and shoes. I think when they eventually were exiled to Hawaii, she literally packed diamonds in diapers. Because of the Marcos family, the Philippines is still in debt because of how much money they stole and how much money they owe to other people. Anybody who spoke out against the Marcos family would be offed. They would be offed. They would be jailed. They would be, you know, in some cases, unfortunately for the women especially, they would be SA'd. Marcos even created his own media. And if there's anything that we should take from the news that we consume, is that, again, like I mentioned earlier, the news has a really important role in framing the reality that we are aware of. And so if you're only consuming a very filtered sense of reality, then you're not really tuned in to what is happening in the world. And that was pretty much the case with the Marcos regime. I guess. It was a crazy time in history, truly. I'm saying that as if I lived there, but I kind of was there just a little bit. I was in my mom's ovaries and my dad's testicles. No, I'm kidding. No, actually, no, actually, I was. I was kind of there for history. I was there. I was supposed to be in the Ariana Grande music video. I was actually supposed to be in the music video. No, because that's what it's giving. No, truly. Something I discovered in my research as well, which they also touch upon in the documentary, is during the Marcos regime, a lot of people were reliant on money coming from outside sources into the Philippines. And when I say outside sources, I specifically refer to Filipinos who immigrated to the US who were sending money back. Now, when it comes to Filipinos and the Filipino culture, there is this huge sense of indebtedness, and there's a lot of guilt that I think some Filipino immigrants feel when it comes to them leaving the Philippines, living in the US. There's this saying in the Filipino language, which is utang na loob, which is the sense of indebtedness that I think Filipinos have to others and especially their family. And, you know, every single year without fail, like my parents always say, like, okay, what clothes do we not need anymore? What are some things that our relatives really want in the Philippines? Because we always do balakbayan boxes, which is essentially these care packages that we send back home, because again, there's this huge sense of indebtedness. So that was something that the Marcos regime was relying on to sort of support the failing economy, was for Filipino immigrants to wire money to the Philippines. And it was really the Marcos regime that I think catalyzed a lot of Filipinos to immigrate to other places, specifically the US, contributed to why we have so many Filipino nurses today. And the Marcos regime, well, I would say that like this may have happened during the Marcos regime. I can't remember the date specifically, but I do remember that there were a lot of incentives for Filipino nurses especially, to immigrate to the US because, again, like the US has this very interesting history of sourcing foreign labor for their own benefit. I think a major reason as to why many Filipinos wanted to immigrate to the US is because, in comparison to the Philippine peso, the US dollar is, she weighs a lot, okay? She has a heavy weight in comparison to the Philippine peso. So when you as a nurse in the Philippines are making close to what a janitor makes, and you see what nurses in the US are making, you think, oh my God, I'm gonna be rich, I'm gonna be living it up. But when I was speaking with Filipino nurses for my podcast, they came to the US and they realized the cost of living, especially in New York, and they were like, oh, girl, you're really putting me in the ICU and I'm making this much? Like, it's a little bit crazy. But again, like, this isn't the only time that Filipino nurses have come to the US. There's history of them coming prior to that as well, like specifically during World War II, as well as I think sometime in the 1950s as well. Again, like the US has this very interesting history of picking and choosing when they want to like immigrants and people of color. I always think that's such an important thing to remember because, being that Filipinos are Asian, I think there's this perception that the model minority myth is true for all Asians, that we are, basically white adjacent because we follow the law, we're successful, we're this and that, which is completely untrue because if you really look at history, the US, especially the white majority, really picks and chooses when they want Asian Americans specifically to be their friend or to be their enemy. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic is a prime example of that. The political being personal and the personal being political, I think, is a really important theme to touch upon. One, because that was something that became very apparent to me when I did my research for my podcast, because knowing that my dad worked in the ICU and being a Filipino man, knowing that Filipino nurses especially are overrepresented in these kinds of areas made shit very, very real for me. I was like, oh, oh, girl, like that's a little bit scary. It's a little bit scary. I'm feeling a little bit spooked right now. That's an important thing to really take note of, is the personal is political. Like, we simply cannot forget that, especially if you are someone who belongs to a marginalized community. The elections are coming up and they do make me very, very anxious, simply because I know the internet really exposes us on a daily basis to so much tragedy, but we cannot forget that just because we ignore something doesn't mean that it doesn't affect people that we care about, or doesn't mean that it's not going to affect us. Personally, for me, when people say, like, oh, I don't do politics, okay, first of all, if you're a person of color, politics will eventually do you. Like, you might not be somebody who does politics, but politics will do you, okay? And I'm not saying that you have to be someone who's educated on everything simply because that's impossible, but stay tuned to what's happening in your community. People rely on you being ignorant to succeed in being corrupt, to succeed in being a bad person. So it's always good to stay in the know, because I know this is super cheesy, but knowledge is power, baby girl. Like, knowledge is power, baby girl. Like, guys, I need us to stay tuned. Like, listen, I know that the Yap Eat Repeat podcast is all about like intellectual baddies just having a gay old time, but sometimes we also have to sit and be like, ooh, girl, let me like activate my sociological imagination. We have to. And I know that political things, especially as they relate to the genocide in Palestine or just things in general, may make us uncomfortable. But I think, oh, not the popo. Even though I acknowledge that sometimes these things are uncomfortable to deal with, it's important to sit in that uncomfortability and let it fuel you. But I don't think that should be a deterrent for you, but in fact, a fuel for you to get out there, familiarize yourself with what's going on, and take the right action so that things are better in this world. And I don't mean to sound very preachy, but I think that's also a part of the reason as to why I started this podcast as well, is because there is such a huge barrier for accessing important knowledge. And I think making that accessible is one step in the right direction. And the last thing being the COVID-19 pandemic. I would say this is really like the climax, if you will, of this socio political economic history of Filipino nurses and the relationship that the US has had with the Philippines and vice versa. Um, this was really this moment in time, I think, emphasized the colonial ties that the US had with the Philippines, as well as the mistreatment of nurses in US hospitals. Yeah, that I think that was really like the climax of the story is like the COVID-19 pandemic, which emphasized just how much needed to change. One, about how much we prepared for pandemics, and two, the lack of care that nurses, especially our Filipino nurses, receive, especially in US hospitals, as they relate to benefits, the respect that they get, as well as the mental health aspect of that too, which I will be talking about momentarily. But again, I think the fact that this documentary debuted in October, which is right before the elections, really emphasizes how important it is to really, really, really think about who you're voting for this year. Um, because listen, I don't really care for anybody who supports Donald Trump. I will proudly say that I do not support that man simply because he is just a terrible person. He is a convicted felon, has multiple SA allegations against him. The list goes on and on. Thinking about this man makes me so upset. Especially because of the way that he did not prepare our US hospitals for the COVID-19 pandemic, and the way that he incited violence against marginalized communities during the COVID-19 pandemic, specifically the Black and Asian community. Having the personal is political and vice versa being an overarching theme, I think, is super important. I know that ignorance is bliss, and sometimes it might feel good to ignore things, but it's important to know what's going on in your community. But people should not have to die. People should not have to suffer. People should not have to be wrongfully incarcerated or discriminated against for you to notice them and care about them. So the second thing that I noticed is the mental health pandemic, which is another thing that I touched upon in my podcast as well. Um, I literally I forget what his name is, but he is a professor at John Jay, and which is interesting because that is my alma mater. And I think I looked him up too because again, like I'm always trying to find my community, find my people in my immediate surroundings because it's like, who Filipino ka ba? Like literally, I had one Filipino friend at this place that I worked at in college, and I was like, oh, girl, I'm from the Philippines, better than Billie Jean, because I make it more than the guillotine. Mahal ko kaya. Like literally. One thing that he said is, aside from the COVID-19 pandemic, he thinks that the next thing that is coming is the mental health pandemic. Now, mental health is a very interesting thing, simply because in many Asian communities, and just I think in a lot of communities of color, mental health is something that is typically taboo and not touched upon. I actually explored this topic for my senior thesis, and that actually might be another podcast episode. Even though I was slacking a little bit in my senior year, if there was one project I really was passionate about, it was my senior thesis. Ooh, girl. I was telling my parents, like, oh, like it's about how immigration can really cause like generational trauma, blah, blah, blah. And they're like, oh my God, Adele, that seems so cool. And I'm like, baby girl, like, this thesis is about you. Like, but I think the mental health pandemic was something that really came to light during the COVID-19 pandemic because in the documentary specifically, a lot of people talked about how they had anxiety about going to work. One of the nurses was diagnosed with post traumatic stress disorder and anxiety and depression because being surrounded by that much death and that much stress obviously will take a huge mental toll on you. And I think mental health is such an interesting thing to talk about because it's very taboo in many communities of color and especially in the Filipino community because, there's a huge yeah, there's a huge Catholic population over here in the Philippines. And, growing up in the house that I did, um, I remember one time being like, Mom, I had an anxiety attack before my swim meet. And this is not to say that my mom is a bad person. I understand where she was coming from. I just don't think that she received it in the way that I wish she did, right? It was very much like, oh, you have anxiety. Anxiety isn't necessarily a thing for, the people of my mom's generation, and I'm not excusing it, but I think it's just an explanation. It emphasized how important it is to take care of your mental health and to talk about it as well. I think because we have such a huge Catholic population in the Philippines, it's always like, oh, you don't have anxiety. Like, you just need to be grateful for what you have. Like, why are you being anxious and depressed if you have everything that you could ever ask for? You just need to pray to God. And I think it's important to approach it sociologically, if you will. Okay, guys, listen. Guys, one of my favorite classes that I've ever taken in college ever was the sociology of mental illness. There are so many sociological and cultural factors that affect the way that we view and treat mental health. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge those differences. Like, also recognize objectively people just need help with their mental health. And maybe I'll also make that a podcast episode too, about like the sociology of mental illness. It's okay to pray to God. If that is your form of therapy, that's fine. But I also think we should make room for acknowledging when we have these big emotions and these big feelings like depression and anxiety. Because again, if we ignore them, then it'll just blow up in our face. And I've had many times in my life where, like, I was in survival mode, I was just in autopilot, and because I didn't acknowledge it, because I didn't have time to really just sit with my emotions and relax, I got burnt out. But I really like that this film talked about that, and it also showcased older Filipinos talking about it, because I think older generations of Filipinos might not be as receptive to talking about it, simply because there isn't that line of communication for talking about those kinds of things. Because again, like I mentioned earlier, when you come from an immigrant family, your perception of what might frustrate you, what might cause anxiety is so different, because so many, Filipino immigrants experience things like, poverty, a lack of resources, an inconsistent source of income. Some may even have been alive during the Marcos regime. All of that in comparison to maybe their kid who's living in luxury here in the US, and they feel depressed. It's like, what are you depressed about? And I'm not saying that I agree with that thinking. It's just to get into the mind of them. I really like that the documentary highlighted the mental health aspect, because I think it's an important conversation to have, regardless of what cultural background you come from, but especially for Filipinos, simply because I don't think we talk about mental health enough and how much it affects us. I think we, as Filipinos, pride ourselves on being resilient, which is amazing. To rise above it all the time, and to push through adversity all the time and not sit with your feelings, can really blow up in your face. The last thing that I wanted to talk about was it wasn't something that they talked about explicitly, but it's the matriarchal structures of so many Filipino families. Now, maybe I'm a little bit biased because I grew up in a very female dominated family, but I think we don't necessarily acknowledge the matriarchal structures of so many Filipino families. And I'm not saying that this applies to everybody. Maybe you have more of a patriarchal structure. Maybe men are a little bit more at the focus of your household. Um, but I don't think we recognize how much Filipina women are the center of our families and how much they glue everybody together. I feel like we all have that one lula or tita who just brings everybody together. And I love that this documentary touched upon that briefly. So one of the people that they interviewed was, I believe, a journalist and a writer. Her name is Ninochka Rosca, but I will call her Tita Ninochka. One thing that she said during the documentary, which I wish they expanded upon more, because it befuddled me a little bit. I was like, oh girl, like, you may have a point there, but I'm a little bit confused. Like, can we expand upon this? One thing that she said is that in in examining the deaths of Filipino nurses, we don't really look at the gendered aspect of it all, especially as it relates to the death of female Filipina nurses. That is something I wish they had delved into a little bit more, because it was a point that I thought was interesting, but I'm still mulling it over in my head. I'm like, what does that mean? What did she mean by that? Because I'm not sure if there was like specific gendered statistics about like how many Filipina nurses died in comparison to Filipino male nurses. But I think something that she was trying to allude to, at least in my opinion, was, and part of my language, but women do really run shit in so many Filipino families. I think because of colonization, there is this like patriarchal structure to many families in the Philippines. You know, men kind of are the head of the household. But I think we fail to acknowledge the unpaid labor of Filipino women in so many Filipino households, and how much they really just run shit in Filipino families. Like the loss of a Filipina woman in a house, in a given family, is truly felt. And that wasn't apparent to me until my Lula passed away. So this past spring, unfortunately, my Lula passed away, and she wasn't my direct Lula. She was the sister of my Lula, my dad's mom, but she had been in my life from the day that I was born up until the day that she unfortunately passed away. And when I tell you that so many people showed up to her funeral and her wake, it was absolutely crazy. There were people who were tuning in from Zoom, coming in from all different states, which I think really emphasizes how much women are the center and at the helm of so many different Filipino communities. And I like that they touched upon that because, again, like so many women each and every day break their backs to support their family, but don't get recognized because of the patriarchal structure that we live in that expects that kind of unpaid labor from women. But that brings me to my conclusion. So, overall, I absolutely love this documentary. I mean, I've watched it twice for a reason, not just for this podcast, but because it is a story that is not only close to my heart, but I absolutely love the way that they just created this documentary and the way that it flowed. If there's anything that you should get from this documentary is the importance of highlighting BIPOC narratives, and in this case, especially Asian American narratives. There is a history of Hollywood, especially overlooking Asian American narratives. When I was applying for internships and especially graduate school, I really noticed a major gap in Asian American narratives being told in American media. One of the most recent ones that I remember, aside from, of course, like Crazy Rich Asian, not Shin Yun, no, that's not an Asian American narrative. That is literally propaganda. But what is that? It's the one with Simu Liu. It's gonna come to me. It's gonna come to me. But what I'm trying to get at is there is just such a lack of Asian American narratives being told in which they focus solely on Asian American stories. Again, if there's anything that you get from this film is we are sick of seeing white people on, I'm kidding. No, actually, let's be real. We are sick of seeing white people on the silver screen, okay? I think we've had enough, babes. I think we've had enough. And I say that because there are so many amazing things that have come as a result of this documentary. One of them being that this documentary was set to run for, I think, about like two-ish weeks in New York. This documentary outperformed the other movies that they were showing at this particular theater, one of them being Joker, which I know was like a highly anticipated movie. Nurse Unseen outperformed this documentary, and instead of being shown for just 2 weeks, they extended for pretty much the entire month, which I think shows not only one, that Asian American films and narratives deserve to be told, but two, people want this kind of stuff. People want to see themselves represented on the silver screen in media in their immediate surroundings. So people really are hungry for these kinds of stories. But it is also currently eligible for an Oscar, and two, the producer and the director were both invited to the White House as part of the Filipino American History Month celebration. And I think it's important, especially for producers and directors, to understand that with these narratives, like, we not only just want these stories, but we want them to be told in a way that feels natural, okay? Because sometimes when people approach narratives about BIPOC, it gets a little too political to the point where it feels like all we are worth is our oppression, our discrimination. When in fact, like, we are just as normal as the next person. The only difference between me and a white person is I view life through a more racialized political lens. All right, so we have officially reached the end of the podcast, guys. This has been such a trip because this has been such a trip, guys. But honestly, definitely keep yourselves updated with what's going on in the news. Take a look into Nurse Unseen, the documentary. They have an Instagram page, and I think they might have other social media pages as well. But truly, it is such a documentary that I highly recommend to anybody to watch, especially if you're someone who tunes in regularly to the YAP Eat Repeat podcast. Now, as per YAP Eat Repeat tradition, we will be entering into the YAP Eat Repeat segment of the podcast. So, what have I been yapping about? Something I've been yapping about is my new glasses, guys. Okay. So like I'm gonna oh my god, you can probably see my glasses marks. But I literally have been meaning to get new glasses for a hot minute because my eye has been twitching like crazy. And I don't know if it's because I like stare at screens all day or because of the stress or because it's like the contacts that I wear and my eyes are a little bit irritated and dry. But I am so glad to get these glasses now. Like this is a new pair that I have. My previous pair, they were a little bit more large and square and brown, but this one, I feel like she's extra cunty. Like it's not Bayonetta vibes, but it's like Bayonetta adjacent. I thought they were black, but apparently they're dark blue. But I think if I step away far enough, like y'all won't clock it as much, okay? But I absolutely love them. I got like a blue light setting on my glasses because I stare at screens all day. For anybody who stares at screens all day, which is pretty much most of us who are watching the podcast or listening in, I don't know if it's like a placebo effect, but I've noticed that blue light glasses really help with the nausea that I sometimes get and the twitching that I get too. So definitely look into blue light glasses. Something that I've eaten lately. Um oh, this trail mix that I got from Target. Okay. So for breakfast, I usually have like a yogurt and some trail mix because I'm back on my not that I'm back, but like I want to cut back on certain things. But I got this like dark chocolate espresso trail mix from Target, and girl, she ate the booze down. Okay, with a little bit of yogurt. I'm like, ooh, the flavors are melting on my tongue. Like it literally tastes so good. I think it's just because of the chocolate and the espresso. Maybe that's why I like it so much, but that's just what I've been eating lately. And I highly recommend for anybody who loves to go to Target, like, girl, get you some and put it in some yogurt or some ice cream. Something I've had on repeat. Okay, this is a very recent repeat song of mine, but it's Heart of a Woman by Summer, oh my god, Summer Walker. One, because she featured Sabrina and Cordell from Love Island in her music video, which like period, because I love them. And two, it's just a good ass song. It literally reminds me of like 2000s R&B, very much like it reminds me of like So Into You by Tamia. So I'm very much into that. But that marks the end of the Yap Eat Repeat podcast. Thank you to everyone who tunes in on a weekly basis. I will be back with another episode, and I think y'all will really like the next episode, especially because it's a little bit crazy. So I will catch y'all on the flip side. I hope everyone is having a safe and fun Halloween weekend, and I will catch y'all next week. So tune in, follow me on both Instagram. And if y'all find my TikTok, you can find me on TikTok too. But this podcast is available on YouTube and Spotify at the moment. But if y'all are able to put me on to like where else I can put this podcast, definitely let me know. I will catch y'all on the flip side. Bye.